Crime Little Show with me is Will Dobson and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, what is the purpose of fathers? Tim.
Fatherhood is not that common in the animal kingdom, to use an animal analogy. And plenty of animals don't have fathers in the sense that there's a co-caretaker. That is something that humans, I'm not sure about other high mammals, so to speak, but that is something definitely that humans have. And obviously certain types of animals, there's a mating requirement for males. I am well aware of that. I'm not denying that, but humans, human babies and human children in particular are quite helpless. So humans have two-parent raising strategies here. And so do birds also have two-parent raising strategies. Plenty of animals just come out completely, ready to go, like lizards and so forth. They don't even need parents at all. But humans have, of course, two-parent raising strategy. Again, once the act is done, the male, in a sense, and this is what feminists somewhat complain about, the male is basically finished his work, including the human things. So this asymmetry, again, is something which feminists like to complain about. But I would say if science is real, which is so many lawn signs says, in a sense, biology is at some level sexist. So why then are there fathers in the human civilization, so to speak? They aren't technically needed as mentioned here after the initial event. And as technology increases, I'd argue they're going to be less needed here. But if we ever get a test tube baby is a good question here. But we do have in vitro and sperm donors. There's a pop evolution argument which suggests that two-parent households have better survival strategies, or extended family households have better survival strategy, and that's why you get families, the kind of monogamy here. But one thing to point out, and Udwin points this out too, is that in polygamy, which is you have one male and many females, it's actually a fairly common mating strategy here, where you have just one father, and 10 wives and hundreds of children, so to speak. Maybe not hundreds, but a number of them. So one argument is that, and Unwin somewhat attacks this and argues that monogamy, strict monogamy, unleashes more, technological and sort of social energy, because it reduces the sexual marketplace. It cuts down the monopolizing of sexual marketplaces, and it gives parents, and particularly it gives children, more time with their fathers too. So that's one answer. Fathers beget fathers, and that's sort of what that's sort of like the implicit argument in the fundamentalists shall inherit the earth. The more patriarchal societies, or patriarchal light societies, where you have involved fathers of some variety, have a thing. So fathers beget fathers. So maybe fathers just exist because, well, they're in a successful strategy to propagate more people. And moving away from sort of like social evolutionary arguments, and I just want to quick deal with the Freudian analysis, which came up. I like my parents, so I don't really have, to the extent that I have no criticism of them. So the idea that somehow I dislike my father is why I'm doing, that's not in any ways what I'm doing here. So moreover, one of the things which often goes missed by advocates of traditional households is that if the father is working outside the home long hours, or even decent hours, and this is something that's different back in the day, so to speak, where working hours in the industrial revolution were much higher, the father is effectively absent for many hours a week. This analysis, this analysis, by the way, is what I was raised in. I don't have to go too much into my background, but I had this rough analysis: stay-at-home mother, professional class father, working outside the home, and you factor in commuting or walking. The amount of time they're away is very high. So technically, this type of household puts the women in charge, effectively, for much of the day, so to speak. And I don't think this. So one purpose of fathers is just breadwinner or money maker. You go out and make money, or they make money for society, or they make money for their children and their wives, or wives for that matter. And I don't think this bargain isn't malicious per se. I think there's a danger of being simply a weird version of a mobile UBI libertarian Marxist. Somebody has to make resources for society. And in this case, and I think married men with children, I think still are the most productive economic unit in the West. I think they still out earn almost everybody else in terms of working hours, in terms of, now I would argue there's a lot of selection effects involved in there, but there are the most productive sort of like cohort, so to speak, and most socially, the men who aren't married in general are, you have to use sort of common law, because if you have a long-term girlfriend, you're functionally married in a certain sense anyway. But in this sense, men are still the most productive thing. So again, this goes back to the fathers beget fathers argument. So there's a number of things you can blame evolution for this sort of. You can blame social security. You can blame like scarcity on like why certain types of families formations formed. But what is the purpose of fathers here? They aren't really explicitly needed. And again, the animal kingdom, fathers are sort of a scarce variety, even on the animals that have raising, or that they are quote unquote raised, not just hatched and be ready to go. So what do you make? Money maker for society and their children? I mean, the mainstream official culture, which I don't really follow with a capital F, which capital C is quite negative to fathers, I would add. Would you agree? And what do you make of the purpose of fathers? Swithin?
Well, I would say that society as a whole is not hugely favourable towards fathers in general. And I think this is largely due to the influence of the welfare state, because I think the breadwinner aspect, I think, in a sense, is the most fundamental in a sociological sense. The fact that the child is born and is helpless and can't do anything, and also it renders the mother essentially not useless, but significantly impaired for any sort of economic activity outside of the home for any meaningful time, because of breastfeeding, the recovery after birth, etc. That resources are needed, and so, well, who would seem to be the most likely to provide that would be the father, because typically the father will have the most interest in the children and his wife or partner of some description. And so in that sense, the breadwinning aspect is the most important. And so clearly, to the extent that you have welfare, is the extent to which the father is unimportant. Now, I would distinguish, though, here the modern welfare system from a system of charity run by churches and other organizations. Those historical ones tend to be more personal. There was a general view that if you didn't need to, you shouldn't take charity, because you knew who you were taking the money from. It wasn't like just a vending machine and you put, I have, you press in the appropriate code to say that I am poor in certain respect, give me money. And so it's just like a vending machine process. I think that changes the dynamic somewhat. So I think that's the reason, for instance, why polygamy, or more technically polygyny, is relatively stable, because, well, the father can just provide resources to all his wives and children, and so in a sense is relatively stable. Now, that said, is the father merely an economic unit? Well, I don't think so, for multiple reasons. One, the father is generally important for the psychological well-being of the mother, and if the mother has a good relationship with the father, this means that the unit will be generally happier, and will then provide a more stable environment for the child to grow up with, also psychologically, not just numerically. So, for instance, I think it would, this would be an interesting test, although I wouldn't suggest testing it in a proper empirical sense. If you could have a mother and a child who just picks up lots of checks and can live relatively economically securely, compared with the situation where the father is there to some extent, I can discuss the long working hours in a second. It is an interesting area. I think that the general sort of psychological health of the family is likely to be better in the case where the father is around. Another interesting point to make here as well is, I don't know if this is universally true, but it seems to be the case that children born of sperm donors or children who are adopted have a great interest in who their biological father is, or just in general their biological parents. So there is a sense in which people want to know where they came from, and this provides value in some way. As to exactly how, I'm not entirely sure. But it does seem to be the case that for children in general, knowing who your father is and the father having a good relationship with mother, such that you have a good relationship with your father, provides a strong basis in which to act in the world. I've heard stories that, I mean, an obvious example here is divorce, although you could argue this is a different situation because you have because you knew your father and the father then left, which is different from them not being there. But let's just take it as an approximate case that we can discuss. I mean, you could always make the argument that it would have been worse if the father would have stayed around. But in most cases, it would seem that I've come across, divorce does not have a good impact on the children, far from it. And I've also heard things, even in the case where parents, that children are adults and the parents divorce when the parents are adults, that also has a large negative impact in a way which you wouldn't expect, because you think, well, if you're developing, that would make that would have a big impact. But when you're older, would it really? And from what I've read, that seems to be the case, which I think maybe then goes back to the idea of stability that having the mother and father around makes. Now, to the working outside the home, I do think that's relevant, and I do think makes makes fatherly impact less positive if they're not around that much. Although I suppose that there is a minimum amount that they would be required to be around to be sort of sociologically considered a father. And I do think the breadwinner working out, I'll put it this way, I think in many circles there is too much emphasis placed upon just earning more and climbing the corporate ladder for the sake of doing so, rather than figuring out why you're doing it. And it would be the case that in some cases, if not many cases, it would be better if the husband and father worked fewer hours, earned slightly less, and was able to be around and put more direct input into the children in a way in which would have been existent in a pre-industrial household. Although obviously this is going to be context dependent on various other factors. But I do think it would be beneficial if there was a general feeling that I should try and be around and input the children as much as reasonably possible. And if I had a choice between earning more money and commuting further and not commuting as far, earning a bit less, that obviously depending on the magnitudes, being around more would be better. And this tends to be the case of people on the deathbed. I mean, Rick Story has pointed this out. One big regret of men is not spending enough time with their children. So I think that's borne out even in sort of autobiography in some extent. So that would be my somewhat rambling explanation of fathers.
Which I think some paleos think is unique to modernity, but I think it existed in the past too, in the sense that on the one hand, to be a successful person, in particularly a male, but I'll just expand it to person in general. There's an idea that requires like 16,000 hours or something like that, where it requires a number of hours that you have to do to quote unquote make it, so to speak. You can't do something well. I think Elon Musk has the joke, nothing of worthwhile was ever accomplished on 40 hours a week. And again, I know Elon Musk, welfare king, as they're all subsidized by the government. But I think that mentality is basically correct. Like, if you want to be a great piano player, if you want to be a great warrior, if you want to be a great sailor, if you want to be a great anything on some level, you have to sort of put in a lot of hours and pull it off. Interesting enough, on the female side of the thing, one of the interesting things that you pointed out is that the idea that women could have both, and we sort of discussed this in the Marxists, why are Marxists so supportive feminism episode. One of the things we pointed out was that on some level, if women can be stay-at-home mothers, and they can't be both full-time mothers and full-time whatever, piano players, wage slaves, whatever you want to call them. You can't in effect do both very well. And I always thought it was interesting that, like, the Catholics, and to some extent the Orthodox, although the Book of Timothy says otherwise, possibly, although that's just for eldership, that the Christian leadership was supposed to be just single men, in a sense. Again, Paul, Timothy, various others were, Christ himself was all single men. So I do think there's a tension that exists in the sense that, there's a reason why part-time workers aren't paid as much as full-time workers. And I think that reason, you could say that reason is sort of scarcity is bad. Again, you could root this back to evolution or the Garden of Eden. Why is there scarcity in the world, and so to speak? Well, like, you can't be a part-time 747 pilot. That just doesn't make sense. You can't be a part-time admiral or a part-time, fisherman out on the, a lot of, high productive, successful jobs just require you to be away, so to speak. And this shows up with, like, this also used to show up with, like, modern women in particular, but older women, like ladies of aristocracy, so to speak. They didn't know their children, so to speak, because they were expected to be in court, or they expected to be, professional socialites. So they, their children were largely raised by nannies and others, not them themselves. So maybe the yeoman farmer model is the ideal, where you have everyone sort of works communally. But you posted an article which is interesting, which sort of made fun of the fact that men who spend too much time around their wives and children aren't fully men; they're sort of housemen. So I think that comment is somewhat interesting here. But I do think there is a tension. What do you make of that tension, Swithin? And what do you make of the idea, like, nothing good is accomplished on 40 hours, so to speak? And that's true for women too. I don't think any woman who's a CEO of Lockheed can be a successful mother, or the Prime Minister of England can be particularly involved parent, for better or worse. There might be arguments that certain levels of involvement is pernicious, and I actually agree with this to some level. That, there's too much helicopter parenting, and there's too much of that. So maybe, in a certain sense, having parents away somewhat, although they're just rounded off to daycares, which had the same kind of, like, nanny state there too. So that's, what do you make of that tension, Swithin, with respect to the purpose of fathers and men? Swithin?
I'm generally in agreement with the Elon Musk claim. I think that's certainly true. That a lot of great works, as it were, are achieved by putting an inordinate amount of hours in. I suppose then the question is, well, when it relates to fathers, what do these men do? Now, I suppose you could argue that sociologically speaking, of course, you're probably going to want these guys to reproduce at some point, because, well, good genes is what you would want. And also, you could additionally make the claim that you probably don't want them to have children too late, because I'm pretty sure it's the case that male sperm declines in quality after a certain age. I don't remember what it is. I think it's probably 50. So we have a bit of an issue here, because if this guy does reproduce and has a wife and children or whatever, how is he going to be a good good father? Which is an interesting question. Well, I suppose the easiest way around this to some extent is to say that, firstly, we need a society in which people can start working on whatever they need to work on to get those hours in as early as possible, which of course then would mean well, getting rid of the schooling system as it's currently constituted, so that so instead of actually working usefully only really from like the age of 21 if you go to university, that you can do it from 14 or 12, then that's an additional like 7 years that you can work. Also, I think it probably already exists. I mean, Keith Preston has talked about it, and it effectively is the normalized situation whereby for some high status men, they marry at like the age of 45 and their wife is 20. That in certain circumstances seems to be the best thing to do, assuming they are married, because obviously one thing you could say is they just remain single, which is interesting for the development for medieval Europe, because a lot of the most intelligent men basically were celibate and went to the monastery, which is, I believe, one of the arguments. I can't remember if this is exactly what Richard Lynn argues, that one of the reasons why the Jews are so intelligent is because the rabbis were the most intelligent, but the rabbis had loads of children because they were married, and pronatalism was part of the culture, and there was high social status attached to the rabbi. He had relative amounts of wealth, and so his children would survive where others would die. So in the case of having to put lots of hours in, I think probably it's more of a case of encouraging people to do that as young as possible, and doing the great work, and then being able to step back a little bit at some point, and then marrying, and then having children. This would not necessarily be normative for everybody, but I think that's probably the best way that you can do it. Also, as well, is if you're going to do like these great things, it's unlikely that you continue to do it all. I mean, for instance, obviously, Bill Gates is dubious in certain respects, but his development of home computing software was very, very good and beneficial and changed the world. But basically, his major innovation had been done by 1995. I mean, yes, okay, Windows has developed since then, but essentially, since Windows 95, it's very. If you looked at Windows 95 and saw it today, it is similar. And the major innovation took place within like 10, 20 years. And so it's unlikely, I think, that someone does continually pulls out stops and does great works for the rest of their life. So even if that said, though, of course, even if they're still sort of CEOs or step back a bit from it, they might have work more hours than others would. But I mean, it's going to depend on their circumstances. And I think just the idea that they need to focus on to have some sort of familial focus is important. And I think that they would probably think so when they sort of retired anyway. So I think that's the way I would try to square that problem.
What do you make of the we talked about the tension of the 40 hours, nothing's ever good done on 40 hours, and the idea of involved fathers in particular. But do you think fatherhood? You brought up the rabbis example. Do you think I could extend this to Abrahamic, although Islam is more polygamous than monogamous, so it might not be them. But you think fatherhood is a kind of, I sort of opened my argument bringing up sex and culture by Unwin, and as well as shall the fundamentalists inherit the earth. Do you think fatherhood is a kind of quote unquote superpower on some social or again, whether evolution is the case or not is a good question, but or more broadly, animal model, because animals that have two parents tend to be quite more complicated or interesting looking, so to speak, like eagles, some of the birds, so to speak. The animals that have some form of family structure, so families are kind of like a technology. I think whales and other things. Now again, oftentimes the male, there's only one male and a bunch of very young males have to leave once they get older, in these sort of like lion herds and type of things like that. But you think fathers are kind of to use the Neil Ferguson term, a killer app, so to speak, with him?
In a sense, yes. Predominantly due to their psychological disposition is different from the mother, and so provides balance. I mean, the obvious thing is risk aversion. Women tend to be more risk averse than men. So typically in a way in which mothers could indulge their children and go, oh, are you okay if you get injured or whatever? Oh, no, don't do that. The father is much more likely to be pushing the children, which of course is good for the boys in certain respects. So they don't feel that their development is not, their natural sort of inquisitiveness and sort of aggression in a general sense, it would be stunted by a single female household in a way that is less likely to be done in one where the father is around, at least to some extent. And as well, actually, I think actually having the father around is a moderating influence on the mother's risk aversion, because she is of a situation where she has security in a way that she otherwise wouldn't have. Now, of course, you can replicate this stuff if you're very rich and polygamous. But if you're relatively poor and you're a single mother, then you're unlikely to have a generalized feeling of security that you might have otherwise if the father of your children was around, financially and also physically. So I think fathers are important in that respect. Another way in which fathers are important is the impact on daughters, that they provide a good model for the daughters to think about manhood in general, and then of course future mate selection. If they're of general view that, well, men just come and go and they don't stick around, then that is going to incline them to higher time preference, if I remember correctly in this context, R selection when it comes to mating, which is probably not going to be one that is focused on long-term ability of the father to provide resources and investments in the children. On the other hand, it's just going to be, oh, let's just have sex, have kids, and well, I'll just leave them to it. Now, of course, there is the problem of overparenting, which I would agree with. But in general, it would seem to be the case for the development of civilization in general, generally speaking, having a longer term horizon is going to be more beneficial than being short-termist in general. And so I think those are a few ways in which fathers can encourage appropriate risk taking and moderate risk aversion, and also provide a good role model for daughters.
The risk-taking, non-risk-taking dichotomy is an interesting point with respect to men and women. I think in general, males, and this shows up in sort of car accident data, males in general are involved, as well as other sort of dangerous sports. Males represent most of the, a significant portion of fatalities, so to speak, are men. So I think that's a sort of good intuitive way to sort of empirically back up the claim that men are more risk-taking and women are less risk-taking, so to speak. What percentage of being, a male, so to speak, is being a father? And a correlated question to this point is related to celibacy. Now, you get the sort of incel phenomena, but you brought up the monasteries, and I also brought up the point about in Christianity that many of the key people in the New Testament are celibate, or at least probably celibate, or at least it's not explicitly named, so to speak. Again, whether or not Christianity is true, again, but Christianity is influential. So even if it's not true, it's which means it should be discussed, and not only discussed, if plenty of people view them as role models, then by definition that's just going to be what people do, so to speak. And I think we still live in a sort of Christian haunted society too. So my question here is a male without children in some sense, male? Because one of the critiques some reactionary people make of Christianity is it's a moderately feminized religion. Again, now the Old Testament I think is a little different, and I think I think you have to sort of divorce heresy from doctrine, heresy from orthodoxy. Although you get into a lot enough rabbit holes, it becomes somewhat unclear here on what exactly is and isn't the case here. And just because that happened in the past doesn't mean necessarily it's going to happen now. And you do have different technological factors, industrialization, new technologies, which we discussed in the what is the purpose of sex and why do people have children. So this, in a sense, is a related episode to them. But what percentage of being a male is being a father? What percentage of being a father is being a male? I sort of reversed. I moved the subject of that sentence around, so to speak, to manipulate that question here with it. But it seems like it's in a sense fairly important, so to speak. And what do you make about the relationship Christianity has to this phenomena here? We've somewhat discussed this before as well, but I think it's a topic that is worth bringing up again. Swithin?
According to the anthropologist and anthropologist David D. Gilmour, he argues that in all cultures around the world, there's a general plank of things that are considered the essence of masculinity, which he calls the 3 Ps, which are provision, procreation, and protection. So the ones we've talked about so much so far is provision and economic resources. The other 2 are clearly procreation and protection. Now, it does seem to be the case that having children, and or at least, having children, having a wife is something that is generally considered part of being a man. Or at least not having children, but at least being sufficiently attractive to females that you can bed them. This is generally considered a male trait. I mean, a clear example of this, which you could consider a male fantasy in a certain respect, is James Bond. James Bond is a very masculine man. Well, maybe not in the recent films, but in sort of the Connery ones, etc. He is sort of very masculine.
The popular ones that do well at the box office.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that definitely does seem to be part of what a man is. I mean, if for instance, and also with children as well. I mean, maybe not so much now, but if your wife can't get pregnant, then a lot of it might be due to the father not being sufficiently masculine to be able to impregnate her. So this certainly does seem to be an important aspect. So with respect to Christianity, I do think that I think when it comes to the men in the New Testament, well, one thing, I don't think you get the impression that they're particularly feminine. I mean, just take Jesus for an example. I mean, the way in which he conducts himself and the content of his speech doesn't really seem classically feminine in his discussion of the brood of vipers, etc., of the Pharisees. But as to whether they're single or not, it's unclear. Paul may have been married at some point, but his wife had died. But a lot of the single men there who sort of grow the church in the early church in, say, Acts, for example, I think it is very much of a situation of being like a vanguard. And I think a vanguard tends to be single men because they have less to lose and they can focus all their time on producing this outcome. I mean, so look at political movements of like the Bolsheviks. I don't remember if Lenin was married, but or even if he was, it didn't have much to do with them. And a lot of revolutionaries are young single men because they have the energy and the passion to put everything on the line for whatever they're trying to do. And so I think that's true to some extent when it comes to things in Acts. Now, when it comes to celibacy later, I think that's a different situation because you have like a settled Christian society in which you didn't have in the first century AD. So the situation is different.
These are. Do you think the monasteries of the medieval times and other times and now today are in effect harmful to the broader society in the sense that they're not in the productive, so to speak, social pool and gene pool. There's arguments for and against this. One of the things that's interesting sociologically is children of ministers tend to be we'll say a schizophrenic lot. This is sort of an argument I think in favor. Like I always thought that I would never want my father to be a minister. Like that, if you imagine a Rawlsian scenario, I think that's one of the worst scenarios. Like a lot of Nietzsche, for example, there's a book written by, I think it had about chapters like Nietzsche, for example, had a father was I think a Calvinist minister of some variety. Now he died when he was young, but there's a lot of examples of I think Engels had a similar upbringing as well. So there is an extent which there's arguments for and against this. And I think the Christian angle has to be somewhat focused on because the paleos, like if you get away from the sort of the sort of the social liberal whatever propaganda or whatever you want to say, then you have to sort of say, well, what should be the ideal of things? So then you look to Christianity and you have to sort of look at to speak Paul, Timothy. And you're right that a lot of these people died quite brutally. Like I think Timothy was killed in Lycus or some Ephesus, Turkey. Paul was in jail. Saint Andrew died in ex-crucifix, I think. So yeah, you're right that there are quite risk-taking macho men in a sense. That's entirely the case. They're not social workers by no means in that sense. But I do think if you look toward them. So back to the first question I asked, do you think these monasteries as a phenomena are harmful, or do you think they are beneficial? Do you think the, so to speak, clergy class should be celibate, or do you think the clergy class should be of the community here? Because you could argue the Anglican Church is interesting in the sense that compared to the Catholic ones, they could be married. Now again, you could say that's all about King. The Henry wanted the own marriage divorces. There's certain historical contingencies of why these events happened, of course. But what do you make of that, Swithin? What do you make of like the sort of clergy class here and its role? Should they be celibate or should they be married with family? Because you could argue that one of the problems of having family is you have your own interests, not to speak the community interests here. Swithin?
With respect to monasteries and etc., there are interesting arguments both sides. My intuition is to say that no, I don't like monasteries because I'm from a Protestant background. So that's my default position, and also to say that ministers should have sort of wives and children, which I think is I think seems to be the clear case from the epistles, although you could have other arguments. I mean, there are clearly practical arguments for not being there are clear arguments for not being married. I mean, you have more time to deal with parishioners, etc. I mean, this does seem to be the problem of being the child of a minister, is that they tend to be called upon so much by everybody at any hour of the day that it just seems to be the case that, well, basically the father neglect their children, not by design. It's just that I think they've put insufficient procedures in place so that they can actually do their job of sort of shepherding their family rather than just shepherding the church. To monasteries, I was thinking about monasteries. The reason I've been interested in monasteries is I was thinking, how can you make, you mentioned incels, is how can you make men who single men who won't marry, how can you give them some form of social status and be sort of useful members of society? And so I think, well, okay, something like a monastery is potentially useful in certain respects. I suppose I would say the reason I dislike monasteries is that you have to take the vow forever. So if it was the case that you thought, well, actually now we've been working most in the monastery, we found this girl somewhere and you'd like to marry, you can't. That's where I think is the issue. And interestingly, when I looked at this a number of months ago, the oath for life was what the reformers objected most to about monastic orders, as opposed to their actual construction. Although that said, in certain aspects of monasticism and also with the early church with the Desert Fathers, was a strain of asceticism, which thought that the flesh was bad, which there is tradition in the church history for, but I do seem to think is contrary to, want to phrase, orthodoxy in the scriptures. So, I mean, issue with the monasteries, I remember seeing a guy argue that actually a lot of the intellectual developments were focused predominantly on the monasteries rather than the universities. Universities, even back in the medieval period, were focused on more practical pursuits of becoming a physician or becoming a lawyer, whereas a lot of the sort of development of philosophy took place in the monasteries. And there does seem to be, and Ed Dutton has talked about this actually with Anglican clergy. He says in the 19th century, the Anglican clergy weren't hugely pious to a large extent. They did it because they could get paid a decent amount of money and they could focus on what they were interested in. And they could just read sermons that were already written by somebody else and, talk to the congregation, do the Sunday service, and then do what they wanted. And so there does seem to be a benefit of being able to get people who are intelligent to focus on areas in which they have interest, because it does yield useful stuff. I think Ed Dutton pointed out that this was in one of his episodes, a year or two ago actually, on a lot of scientific discoveries were from clergy in the 19th century, because they spent most of the time just selecting fossils or collecting rocks and stuff and writing about them. So there are certain aspects of monasteries which I do think are important, although I do think having an all-male institution, I think like that is fine for single men. That seems to probably has a place. But making one take an oath for life, I do think is a problem. Also, what I would say is most men, if they're actually intelligent and can earn a reasonable amount of money at some point, they're probably going to be attractive to some woman at some point. And so it would probably be better if they reproduced than if they didn't. Not in all cases, but if you're not a particularly attractively looking man, but you're pretty darn rich by the age of 50, you'll be able to find some women who will find you attractive enough to marry you. That does seem, generally speaking, to be the case. So I think there are aspects of monasticism which I think are important, but that are useful. But I don't think full oath for life and celibacy is necessarily a good thing.
Marriage, and particularly fatherhood in the sort of modern, industrialized, or that matter, since the first century, Christianized, or some version of that concept, a form of, I'll say, enslavement, or maybe not enslavement, is in a form of a servitude in a sense. Because you brought up the breadwinner thing and the obligations point in the one article you forwarded me through the document here. Because single men tend to beget revolutions here, large populations of single men. So you could argue that fatherhood is a form to control men. And I think that's the subtext of Unwin's argument too. That's sort of, you sort of harness the horse rather than let the horse run wild, so to speak. And there's sort of corollary evidence for this, like in North Korea, for example, as well as from my understanding, China up until recently, the only people that were allowed to go abroad were people with you see this with North Korean labor camps in Russia, is they have to sort of have a wife and children at home, so that they have some leverage over them. They if they run away in Dubai or wherever they're expected to work, their children will be, so to speak, held ransom, so to speak, in that sense. So, and it's a way to sort of control them as well. And of course, again, this is a phenomenon. They work harder. They work so they make money for them at home, so they have a nicer life than everyone else. And I guess the other point on the other side of this is going back to the clergy class. Considering the way that many of the New Testament people died, isn't them having a children in a sense makes them split allegiances. They won't defend the truth, so to speak, because the social rulers of the day will hold their children hostage. Would Timothy have gotten stoned to death, which is what supposedly how he died? I was recently look up the history of him. Would he have gotten stoned to death for preaching in public, or would he have just stayed quiet about things if he had his own children to be held ransom, so to speak, by society? So maybe there's a sort of split allegiance. So like the question of the priestly class, so to speak, you go back to risk taking. In a sense, families might reduce the risk taking aspect of the risk taking aspect of men by domesticating them. So is marriage, or more particularly fatherhood, because I think just a man marrying a woman having no children, they're arguably more like close friends than they are. The family is a sort of multi-generation unit in that sense. So is that a way to, like, so to speak, domesticate, or to use harsher language, enslave? Because I think clearly one of the interesting things about modern society, and we talked about this, I think, with Rick's story, is you get the phenomena of like men being expected to pay out. And you see, this is the way I think society is implicitly still expects the same thing as men. They just arguably expect more. So you still get these huge payouts men have to pay in these sort of family court laws, and the women are still by default. So this is what the men's rights advocates, form up here. So that thing still exists today. So Swithin, what do you make of that? Is it a sort of way to domesticate and control? What do you make of that, Swithin? That's my final question here.
So are children or marriage to control men, or both? Just to clarify.
How I would say both is the answer, but you could pick which one you think.
Yeah,
but
I mean, well, okay, fine. So in a sense, yes, they do. Especially children more so in certain respects, because you have more obligations, you have more to lose, and so the nail that sticks out will be hammered down. So the Japanese proverb is you're more likely to accept being hammered down because you have to conform in a way. I suppose this isn't necessarily an argument against marriage per se, but more of a case of that. Well, actually, to say to young men, don't just sort of try and go around and try and get and find a wife and basically simp out. Focus on what you do well and get better at it, because you can claim, well, women like competence, and if you're very competent, you'll be attractive, and also then you can perform a good sociological role when you're in the best position that you can do it. Whereas you can't when you're older. And I suppose as well, this would be this is also relevant for like young men being able to, teenagers, if you want to use the common language too, to work from a younger age and earn, so they become somewhat financially independent, so that they can actually be this sort of this necessary sort of, not necessarily revolutionary force, but this sort of force of opposition to the status quo if it needs challenging, and to challenge it well. I mean, the lack, for instance, of young men who oppose lockdowns, etc., to a large extent was interesting. Although you could argue there aren't enough of them, but that again gets to a birth rate argument. As to marriages, I suppose you could say marriage to some extent softens men to some extent, but I don't think that necessarily means that they are unmasculine anymore. Although I could see that being again. I mean, it would depend on what was expected of the man there. So I think there's an aspect of that. One other thing I think we haven't discussed, although this isn't as relevant as it would have been historically with fathers, I did mention it implicitly earlier, and this is the third P I mentioned earlier of David Gilmour's, which was protection. The men have tried to protect the community. Now, what you have today is, because everything is farmed out to the military and the modern police, you essentially have a group of men who have, and actually now disarmed, especially in England, you can't defend anybody apart from with your fists. And so I think in that respect, that aspect of the father being able to protect his family is much more worthwhile. Well, has much less value now anymore, because you farm it out to other people. And I would think in Ancapistan's Within the Stem, I think the most likely situation is for a volunteer militia to be the mainstay of any army. I think in that sense, there would be masculinizing forces at work, so that men and fathers would be sort of able militarily, relatively physically fit, and can, shoot a gun, do general sort of military things, because that'd be required to protect the community, and by implication then your family. And also actually as well in the masculizing aspect, whilst young men were probably attracted to that, I mean, trying to defend your family might then give you more impetus to join the volunteer militia that you might not otherwise have decided to join. So in that respect, depending on the conditions of defense services, family might actually have a more of a masculinizing effect on fathers than not. But clearly when you have standing armies and stuff, that's not going to be the case in the same way, although it's something that I think is worthy of note. Too many comments with respect to the protection plank of fatherhood.
Oh yeah, the protection plank by being farmed out to the one of the reasons I think men and women are functionally equal today is thanks to that. I mean, the state basically holds a monopoly on defense, which was not the case in the sort of past, even in the recent past, let alone the distant past. So I do think that in that sense, one of the functional growth of that is egalitarianism of some variety. It has to do with the fact that there's no, I mean, it's the police or the military that does it. So yeah, I would agree. This is in Capistan for the win for the paleo. So that's the fact that they can't protect themselves. I do think argumentatively, it's interesting that you brought up about the lockdowns. And still today, the people today who are the great intellectuals or who defend radical, crazy ideas, for the most part, are men. You could say the best, one of the best, all the best lockdown critics, Jeffrey Tucker, Alex Berenson, and so forth. They're all men. So maybe even argumentatively, men still, to a large extent, play that role. Although on the other side, the best, the people that practice the offensive part of this are also still men or males. If you think about the big villains of the global lockdown craze, it was probably Fauci, Ferguson, and so forth. So I think as with these things, there's always there are always interesting wrinkles here. But I think whether they can't defend with their fists, I still think on a social level, You see that with you see it with Christianity, you see that with various other policies that since you can't defend yourself, so there. That's one of the reasons why I read a lot and do this show. I to a certain extent think, well, I'm defending society or defending myself from bad ideas. So since you can't use your fists here, and gun laws in the United States are sort of creeping up so far. You see this with recent things about the Supreme Court versus New York and so forth. So that trend is continuing here. Again, there's other phenomena that go away, but I do think the fact that that physical force no longer exists, for better or for worse, to some extent, that plank is just that plank is just no longer exists, which is why I think the economic one morphs, becomes much more salient. Like this is one of the things where, in general, women don't co-populate with men who make no money or make less money than them. So that's just sort of a fast fact. And again, you can like that fact, you can hate that fact, but in a sense, that's just the way it is. I mean, I opened up with the idea that biology is sexist. I think this point is arguably the same thing too. So there are certain facts that just exist, for better or for worse, that can't seemingly be changed easily enough here. And I do think that if the state does collapse, now whether the state will collapse or not, self-defense of the physical variety will come back, so to speak. Well, it has to come back. The state no longer exists, although we make it anarcho-tyranny. But that's my final comment here with respect to the purpose of fathers. I did this episode as correlate to our why do people have children and what is the purpose of sex argument here. We sort of provide a model and a sort of a question and answer, because like you move away from the sort of social liberal mindset. You should have to ask, like, what should be the ideal way you should do things. If you want to criticize the current existing model, great, but then you have to think, well, what's the idea you should do? And I see a lot of the things that certain people criticize about the current society roots in Christianity, or roots in ancient Greece, or roots in something that aren't entirely alien. So that's sort of why I wanted to do it. And, we've done sort of what is the ideal police. What would police look like in Kapistan if they would? So we actually talked about this on a whole episode once. So now I don't really have any more comments on this. Thanks for doing it. If you have any more comments, that'd be great.
No, that's absolutely fine. No, I do think men will get much more social status. I think is true if society does collapse, and that's certainly true because the welfare state's gone, and you might get killed. So having somebody who is relatively martially orientated and pretty strong might be quite handy. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and anyone you may find it of interest. Please subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And finally, if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.